Christmas is my favorite time of year. The holiday season is the perfect time for me to forget all of my worries, get cozy by the fire, watch the snow fall gracefully outside my window, and then remember that that's actually my romanticized version of Christmas. The real thing usually involves way more panicked shopping, empty wallets, and me complaining that it's already too cold outside to properly enjoy life. But what's the one thing I can always count on? The holiday specials. Every year I try to go back and rewatch just as many as I can manage, reliving the life of George Bailey, enjoying Buddy the Elf's 4 major food groups, and finally, wondering how Jim Carrey was able to so perfectly replicate the Grinch's facial expressions. Real talk, I'm 90% sure that guy is actually made out of silly putty. No, but as amazing as it would be to talk about that, today we're actually going to take a look at the animated adaptation of Dr. Seuss's classic story, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. At this point, a lot of us are familiar with the tale of the Grinch, the grumpy recluse who tries to steal Christmas from the nearby town of Whoville by literally stealing everything. But recently, a theory has popped up that suggests our beloved anti-hero may have caused way more harm than once thought. Through the simple act of stealing a bunch of stuff, is it possible that the Grinch put all of Whoville in danger? Now, I know that that's a bold claim. While the Grinch is definitely a miserable curmudgeon when we first meet him, he doesn't seem like the kind of guy that would kill everyone. But this theory suggests that the Grinch might not have actually known the consequences of what he was doing. The classic story of the Grinch is pretty well known, but as a refresher, the Grinch lives atop a mountain just north of Whoville, and he spends his time just actively hating Whoville. And one of the reasons he dislikes the Who so much is because of just how much noise they make. The Who as in the people from Whoville, not the acclaimed rock band from the UK, although the Grinch probably wouldn't like that much either. But I can't say I don't sympathize with the Grinch. He obviously knows how Whoville celebrates things and dreads having to endure all the ridiculous sounds they make with their instruments, like jing tinglers or tar tinkers or whatever this is. But if you're familiar with Seuss's other works, you might have noticed something. A reason why the Whos are so loud all the time. And that can be found in one of his other classics, Horton Hears a Who. In this story, an elephant, Horton, hears a town full of little Whos living on a tiny speck of dust in the middle of the jungle. He then takes the speck of dust and then places it onto a clover and makes it his personal mission to protect the tiny town at all costs. That town's name, of course, is Whoville. Dramatic sting goes here. As the story of Horton progresses, all of the other animals in the jungle of Newell, who can't hear quite as well as Horton and his massive ears, get fed up with Horton's rambling about tiny people, so they try to separate him from his clover, going so far as to boiling the clover in hot oil, effectively slaughtering everyone in Whoville. This book is surprisingly hardcore. The only way the Whos are able to save themselves is by making enough noise to be heard by the other animals in the weird jungle that has both elephants and kangaroos living in it. This theory takes that info and applies it to the Grinch. Suddenly, we know why the Whos make so much noise, whether the Grinch does or not. And we can only assume he isn't, since his plan involves stealing loud noise-making instruments and toys, and hoo-hoovers and trum-tookers, rendering the whole town silent, putting all of Whoville and by extension himself into jeopardy. Had the Grinch gone through with his plan, the Whos would have been unable to be heard by anyone, and thus would be in danger of being annihilated by somebody's inconveniently placed footstep. And this is why all the residents of Whoville sing at the end of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, to save their lives. That's an intense theory. But is there anything more to it? Or are the citizens of Whoville doomed to live in constant fear of obliteration, through the hands of the Grinch or otherwise? So the first question we need to ask about this theory is whether or not the Whos from the Grinch are the same Whos as the ones from Horton Hears a Who, because this theory extrapolates an inherent connection between the two stories. This sort of intertextuality is a fairly common literary tactic when it comes to analysis, but this is a particularly literal example of this kind of thinking. I'm not sure if that pun is intended or not. You decide. So is there any evidence from Dr. Seuss's works that shows any signs of these Whovilles being the same? Now there's a lot of adaptations of Seuss's stories to draw from, but for today we'll be taking a look at Seuss's books and the animated specials of How the Grinch Stole Christmas and Horton Hears a Who, which were released in 1966 and 1970 respectively. Both are faithful adaptations of the original stories, as is the 2008 animated adaptation of Horton, since it still hits all the points of the original story without making any drastic changes to that base. However, we won't be acknowledging the 2000 live-action adaptation of The Grinch, and this is because it deviates way more from the original source than the other works mentioned, and also because this show is called Cartoon Conspiracy, not Cartoon Conspiracy, and also one live-action adaptation conspiracy. Thank you for understanding. So to establish the state of Whoville, a good place to start would be to see if there's any examples in Seuss's work that would suggest a shared universe. And in Dr. Seuss's library, there actually aren't that many repeated themes or characters other than in self-contained continuations. Like the sequel to The Cat in the Hat Comes Back. There are only a couple of apparent exceptions. One would be the crossover TV special written by Seuss, The Grinch Grinches The Cat in the Hat, released in 1982. And the other would of course be the inclusion of Whoville in two seemingly unrelated stories. It's not the most watertight proof, but the crossover of The Grinch and The Cat in the Hat means that there is a small amount of precedent for a Dr. Seuss extended universe. A Seussiverse, if you will. But please don't, that was terrible, I'm sorry. And as Horton famously said, evidence is evidence no matter how small. I'm pretty sure that's what he said in the book anyway. But still, it's not enough. Not even close. But there is actually an odd connection between Horton and the Grinch. Not through anything that's there, but through something that isn't there. Horton Hears a Who was first published in 1954, and when Horton first meets the mayor of Whoville, both Horton and the reader are given a formal introduction to the Whos. That's right, everybody, it's story time. "I know," called the voice, "I'm too small to be seen, but I'm mayor of a town that is friendly and—" You know what? I'm not gonna do the voice. "I know," called the voice, "I'm too small to be seen, but I'm mayor of a town that is friendly and clean. Our buildings to you would seem terribly small, but to us who aren't big, they're wonderfully tall. My town is called Whoville, for I am a Who, and we Whos are all thankful and grateful to you." That's pretty straightforward. It explains the Whos pretty succinctly. Now what about in How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which was first published in 1956? How does that story introduce the Whos? Well, the first line in the book, and consequently the animated special, is this: "Every Who down in Whoville liked Christmas a lot, but the Grinch who lived just north of Whoville did not." Weird. There's no clarification on what exactly a Who is. I know this is a children's book, I'm not expecting an anthropological thesis, but it's just weird that there's no further explanation of what a Who is. Unless these Whos are the same, and that's not even taking into account that their designs are essentially identical. At this point, we can be a bit more confident in saying that the Whos are the same species in a shared universe. But are both of these Whovilles the same community? Or do all Whos name their towns Whoville in the most inconvenient naming convention ever? That question's a little harder to answer, and there's far less concrete evidence. Especially since in Horton, Whoville is on a speck of dust in the middle of a jungle, and in The Grinch, Whoville exists somewhere where there's snow. That's pretty much all we're given. And here is where the 2008 adaptation of Horton comes to the rescue. In the movie, there's a brief moment where all of Whoville is covered in snow, despite still being in the jungle of Newell. This is because some frost forms around the clover that they're sitting on overnight. And later in the film, we see during the chase scene between Horton and Vladikov that the jungle of Newell apparently has snow-capped mountains. So with that range of weather, there's definitely something to be said about both Whoville communities being the same. However, there is one more thing that could be the smoking gun. In the 1970 animated adaptation of Horton, when all the Whos ask the mayor what to do, we see a Who with distinct green skin and fur that bears a striking resemblance to the Grinch. However, if that's him, this one little detail is incredibly contradictory to the timeline of this theory, since this theory poses that the Grinch takes place after Horton Hears a Who. If the Grinch has already stopped being a recluse and joined the community of Whoville by the time the events of Horton take place, that shuffles everything around. And if Horton still takes place before the Grinch, why then would the Grinch try to silence the town when he knew he would be putting himself in danger? No matter what, it invalidates things. You know, I never thought that the canonicity of the Dr. Seuss timeline was ever going to give me a headache. So now we're actually going to move on from this and talk about the actual noise in Whoville. This theory states that the reason the Whos start singing on Christmas morning is in an attempt to save their lives, to still be heard despite being robbed of all their noise-making possessions. If that were the case, would that work? To find out, we're going to use a little bit of science. The most common unit for determining sound levels is the decibel, and decibels are measured on a logarithmic scale, which means that small changes in the values mean huge differences. For reference, the quietest most people can hear ranges between 0 decibels and 30 decibels, which is around what a whisper sounds like. Meanwhile, 180 decibels is enough to completely destroy your hearing. With that in mind, the noise level of a singer usually ranges between 70 and 80 decibels, so for the sake of this video, we're just gonna simplify that to 75. Now, in the animated Grinch, we see about 32 Whos gathered in the center of Whoville singing at the very end. But because of how decibels are measured, calculating their sound level is a bit more complicated than just saying 75 times 32. Considering 90 decibels is enough to cause hearing loss at prolonged exposure, 2,400 decibels would probably just make your head explode. But if we math it out, we can see that a group of 32 people singing at 75 decibels would actually result in a sound that is about 90 decibels. But assuming that the Whoville and the Grinch can be heard by the outside world on a normal day, is 90 decibels enough to match the usual ambient noise of the city? To find out, we'll use the numbers of the loudest city on Earth, Mumbai, India. According to a study published by the Maharashtra Pollution Control Board in 2009, the average ambient sound level of the city's busiest district rarely ever went above 83 decibels. So if Whoville was as loud as the loudest city on Earth, adjusted for tiny Who ears, it still wouldn't be enough to overpower their singing in unison. Think of it like you're at a soccer match with a full stadium. It would be the difference between everyone watching the game and just doing their own thing, versus a large group of people in the stadium singing the same thing. In the end, the group is always going to end up being louder. There's a metaphor in there somewhere, I'm sure. But to get back to our main theory, it doesn't seem like the reason they're singing is because they're in danger. In both the original book and the animated Grinch, the title character says that singing in the center of Whoville is in fact an annual tradition. So there isn't really any reason to assume any different in this situation. And just to nitpick just a little bit more, if Whoville depends on being noisy all the time, how come nobody except for little Cindy Lou who was no more than 2 is asleep when the Grinch is stealing their stuff? If this theory is true, it just seems reckless for the town to completely shirk their duties at night. Like I said, this theory is a lot. There is evidence that signifies that not only are both Whovilles the same, but the connection between Horton and the Grinch is entirely possible. And not only that, because we've also seen that their singing would most likely be heard by the outside world. It could be argued that this theory is just trying to instill darkness onto something that's innocent. But at the same time, some people have said that Christmas in Whoville could actually be a celebration of their savior, Horton. It just happens to take cues from our version of Christmas for reasons. Except, of course, their version is louder because it's a celebration of the events of Horton Hears a Who. Now, obviously, that doesn't explain everything, like how come Saint Nick and Santa Claus are still prominent figures in this version of the holiday, but still, I think it's a really cool way to look at it. Since we've looked at both the books and the animated adaptations for this story, there are a lot of little details and contradictions that leave a lot of loose ends. But I can't outright refuse this theory because it's such an interesting take on the tale. So with that in mind, I'm going to rate the conspiracy of the Grinch putting everyone in Whoville's lives in danger 3 reindeer maxes out of 5. But that's just my opinion. Do you think the Grinch put everybody's lives in danger? And what's your favorite Dr. Seuss book of all time? I remember having really fond memories of reading The Cat in the Hat when I was a kid, but I think after writing this episode, it might actually be Horton Hears a Who now. Yeah, I never knew the story took that kind of turn. It was very exciting to read. Be sure to sound off in the comments below, and also let us know if you have any conspiracies you'd like us to take a look at in the future. Also, just a quick update before we go. I know, announcements, exciting! Next week we're going to do something a little different to close out 2016. Both hosts of Cartoon Conspiracy, that is, Alyssa and myself, we're actually going to be in the same place I know, it's crazy. The world's gone upside down. We'll be looking over the last year of the show and just talking about all sorts of stuff. But a big part of that is going to be taking questions from all of you. Feel free to ask us anything you want about Cartoon Conspiracy or any shows that we might be watching that aren't cartoons, or, just anything. We're just excited to talk to you guys. So if you want to ask us something, there should be a comment stickied underneath the video that you can just submit all of your questions in that one place, so it's easy to organize. We're really excited just to be able to get to talk to you a bit more directly. Until then, be sure to like this video and subscribe to ChannelFrederator and have a happy holiday. And now you should probably go spend some time with your loved ones. And remember, Frederator loves you.